In the 19th century, the Southern economy was completely dominated by cotton. The event that made possible this economic phenomenon was the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. Eli Whitney was actually a gun manufacturer who um, managed to solve the problem of how you separate the cotton from the seeds. When you had to do it by hand, it took a very long time, and it made cotton expensive and not very practical as an export crop. But what Whitney did was invent this simple mechanical device. You just simply operated it by cranking the handle. And what you have here is the waste from the cotton, and here is the processed cotton. Um, Here is the raw cotton. So through a series of teeth here, it simply removed the seeds from the cotton. Now, one of the effects of this was that it greatly increased the demand for slaves because now the South had a new and extremely profitable crop, and the labor for this was provided by slaves. Slavery moved westward along with westward expansion to Alabama, to Mississippi, to Louisiana, and later to Texas. These were areas that were very well suited to the growth of cotton. Now, to give you an idea of the impact of the cotton gin, we need only look at the numbers. The cotton gin, remember, was invented in 1793. The year before that, there were 138,000 pounds of cotton exported from the United States. For the entire nation, that was really not very much. And then the year after the cotton gin was invented, the number jumped to 1.6 million pounds, an 11-fold increase in just 1 year. Now, when you look at a few years later, just 7 years after that, it had jumped to 48 million pounds. And by 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, it was 1.65 billion pounds of cotton. That meant that cotton production had grown over 1,000-fold between 1790 and 1860, basically between the American Revolution and the outbreak of the Civil War. And by the Civil War, cotton made up 2/3 of all U.S. exports in the entire nation. This cotton export was going to Britain primarily, and it fueled the British Industrial Revolution, which was led by the textile industry. And large planters gained more and more land, used their profits to buy more and more land, and also more and more slaves. Now, this is a map of cotton production in the South. Each dot represents 2,000 bales of cotton as of 1860. Now, you see here the extreme density in western Mississippi along the Mississippi River and into Louisiana, and also a certain area of Alabama here. This area here, it was known as the Cotton Belt. You can see the impact that cotton had. Now, if we look at another map, this is a map of the distribution of slaves. The darker areas represent more population density, a higher concentration of slaves per square mile. And you notice that this pattern here is very similar to the shape of the Cotton Belt. If you, again, we'll look at these two maps together and look at the pattern here in Mississippi and Alabama, the same pattern here in distribution of slaves. So clearly, the slaves are providing the labor, and cotton is the one factor that is most important in the growth of slavery. Now, there are other areas where slavery is important. You can see along the coast here of South Carolina, that's rice. There is still tobacco grown in Virginia, although the industry had declined somewhat by then. But the real driver of slavery, though, is cotton. Now, slavery, as you would expect, grew very dramatically. Between 1780 and 1860, it grew eightfold, from 500,000 to 4 million. The growth was mostly from natural increase, not the importation of new slaves. After 1808, according to the Constitution, the Congress had the power to ban the importation of more slaves, and they chose to do that. They did it with the support of Virginia because Virginia had a surplus of slaves now that the tobacco industry was not what it used to be, and they wanted to sell slaves to other southern states, so they were quite willing to reduce the competition and cut down on the number of slaves that were being brought into the country and eliminate the importation of slaves. Now, why this natural increase? Well, first of all, compared to the Caribbean, those sugar islands, there was better nutrition and a healthier environment. The fact that no more slaves could be imported made some slave masters more aware of protecting their own slaves, not because they had great regard for them in most cases, but because they represented property and investment. There was so much more land that it was easier to provide at least somewhat better nutrition than these islands in the Caribbean, which were so small and used primarily for sugar. There was another reason, well, as I said, the self-interest of planters after the end of the slave trade led them to protect their slaves, but also to encourage high rates of reproduction among slaves. They did that consciously, kind of breeding. Also, American nursing practices were different from African customs. Women in slave societies in the United States would not nurse children as long, babies as long. And it's a biological fact that when a woman doesn't nurse as long, she is more likely to become pregnant sooner and therefore will have more children and children spaced more closely together. So these factors combine to promote the natural increase in the slave population. Okay, who owns slaves? Well, this may surprise some people, but only 25% of white Southern families owned any slaves at all. And only 1% of white Southern families owned 100 or more slaves. But this is important. Most state legislators, those in charge, the elites running the state politically, owned slaves. For example, in North Carolina, 90% of them owned slaves, whereas only 25% of white families overall owned slaves. Now, these wealthy planters needed to have the support of the entire South. If they hadn't had it, they wouldn't have been able to fight the Civil War as long as they did. And the same pattern that was established in Bacon's Rebellion continued. Poor whites were made to feel superior to blacks. And many of them, most of them, bought into this system of racial superiority, racial levels, hierarchies. A lot of Southerners also had relatives who owned slaves. So indirectly, they were invested in the system. Some slaves were also hired out part-time to non-slave owners. This was a horrible experience for the slaves because those who rented their services would usually treat them very badly and try to squeeze as much work as they possibly could from these temporary workers. There was also a sense of regional pride. The Southerners came to see slavery as central to their way of life, and they resented any interference in their system from the North. Now, if you were a slave, uh, some slaves were on small farms, some were on large farms, and everything in between. There were disadvantages of being in each place. On a small farm, you would have less security, poorer food, because the farmer very often would not have the means to support you very well. Because of this also, you were more likely to be hired out. And as I said, this was something that slaves did not want to see happen. And there was less sense of community. This was a smaller group. There were also disadvantages of being on large plantations, however. There was less variety in the work to be done, more regimentation, in other words, stricter overseers, harsher rules. And the overseers were motivated to rule harshly because they were working for the slave master, and the way they earned their salary was to get as much work as possible out of slaves. So they often ruled very harshly, especially on larger plantations. Overseers were white, drivers were black. The overseer's job depended on keeping the morale of slaves up. So they worked them hard, but if they overdid it, then they could get consequences for that. And what the master wanted to see was consistent work being accomplished without disruptions. So it was the overseer's job to be demanding, but not extremely demanding to the point that they would destroy morale and provoke resistance and sabotage of the work. So this gave the slaves some leverage. They had a phrase, putting on old massa. In other words, when the master would visit, they would be all sweetness and light, and they would be polite. And then when the master spoke with the overseer, he would say, well, these slaves are very respectful, they're cooperative. Why aren't you able to get along better with them? Now, a lot of masters actually engaged in a good deal of self-deception, thinking that really they had one big happy family. And then after the Civil War, when slaves were free to leave, the great majority of them did, and the masters were shocked to learn that this really had not been one big happy family. It had never been that. Just a few words on religion for slaves. The whites in the 19th century came to promote religion, set up churches for slaves, because they thought that it kept them more peaceful. They taught the Bible orally because it was against the law to teach slaves to read. The preachers would say, accept whipping as God's will. It strengthens you. Their favorite biblical text was, servants, obey your masters. This is the kind of religion that they preached. Now, the slaves sometimes also practiced folk religions, which were very, very different. These were religions that had a strong sense of injustice in their theology, but not so much of individual sin. The sense of justice and injustice was more of a group experience. And they also emphasized the joy of life in the face of trials. Realized that most slaves, until very, very late in the game during the Civil War, had no hope of ever gaining freedom. And then they may have had parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who were slaves as well. So they had to make the best of a very bad situation, and a lot of religious uh, practices reflect that. Sometimes also, slaves who were Christian um, would also continue to worship other gods. They would continue with ancestor worship or voodoo or conjuring activities like that because that was part of their religious tradition dating back to Africa and or the Caribbean. The traditional Christian belief that uh, there is one God and that one cannot worship two different gods is not something that the slaves always believed in. Now, whites were fascinated with folk religions, but also scared of them. And they often the masters were uncomfortable with them, but they did not dare to try to put a stop to it because that could create rebellion.